Hello everyone! Have you ever really considered what happens when information is exchanged? For today's lesson, we are going to talk about the stages and the different factors involved in the communication process. Once again, I'm Ma'am Honey, and this is the video lecture for Module 1, Lesson 3 entitled The Process of Communication. From the previous lesson, communication as a process was one of the features of communication that was discussed. It is systematic and cyclical, where it has a series of steps to follow in order to happen. It is dynamic, for it is always changing and is influenced by the communicator's mood and thinking. It is also complex, since one message may be interpreted in many ways by different people. The communication process comprises essential and interconnected elements that work together to produce a system. What are these elements of communication? Can you try giving at least one element? I want you to define and provide an example for it. Feel free to post your answers in the comment section of this video. Elements of communication. To make communication effective, we should be able to understand these critical elements. Each of these 8 elements serves an integral function in the overall process. Let's explore them one by one. Sender or source. The sender is the person who is trying to communicate and wants the other person to receive and understand his or her message. The intent of the message is usually to get the other person to do or understand something. The sender also conveys a message through his or her tone of voice, body language, and choice of clothing. The sender or source could be one other person or a group of people. It could also be in a form of a written material, such as a memo or announcement, which contains an information or message. An example of this is a politician giving a speech or a teacher lecturing a student. Receiver. The receiver is the person who receives the message or for whom the message is meant for. It is the receiver who tries to understand the message and determines the best possible response to be given to the sender. The audience receiving the politician's speech and a student receiving a lecture from the teacher in a classroom are examples of receivers. Unfortunately, in the transfer of information, the receiver may not understand the message the way the sender intended. Various factors such as his knowledge, interpretation, and experiences may be different from the sender. Oftentimes, words have different meanings, and this may affect the receiver's understanding of the message. Message. The message is the information or subject matter the sender or source is intending to share. It can be an idea, concept, emotion, instruction, request, or feeling that a person wants to share with another person. It is the core element in the communication process. The message can be verbal or non-verbal. It can also be intentional or non-intentional. Messages can be encoded into a variety of formats such as oral, written, or visual. Examples of messages include the homework being discussed by a teacher to a student and the politician's proposed reforms for the barangay. Channel. It is the way the message is transmitted. The effectiveness of the various channels fluctuates depending on the characteristics of the communication. In case of immediate feedback, oral communication is convenient. In a situation where the message must be delivered to more than a small group of people, written channels are often more effective. The message may be transmitted orally or in writing. The medium of communication includes the telephone, internet, post, fax, or email. The choice of the channel is decided by the sender, but the message must be crafted to meet the needs of the receiver. When selecting the channel, Several factors must be considered, such as the availability of the channel, suitability, types of receivers, and the communication skills of both the sender and receiver. Feedback. Feedback ensures that the receiver has received the message and understood it in the same sense as the sender meant it. It also provides an opportunity for the receiver to ask for clarification and to agree or disagree. As the amount of feedback increases, the accuracy of communication also increases. Once the receiver confirms to the sender that he has received the message and understood it, the process of communication is complete. The feedback may take the form of a spoken comment, a written message, a smile, the rolling of eyes, a sigh, or some other action. No response is also a form of feedback. Without the feedback, the sender cannot confirm that the receiver has interpreted the message correctly. Context. Context is another way of taking into consideration the setting of the communication process. Questions like, what is the environment like? Is it noisy? Are there people standing around? What was the nature of the last conversation and how did it go? And what cultural factors should be considered? There are several types of communication contexts, including intrapersonal, interpersonal, group, public, and mass communication. For example, communication contexts will be different for a television broadcaster than for a door-to-door salesperson. Determining the context of a particular instance of communication involves considering the cultural, historical, psychological, social, and physical factors at play. Barrier or noise. The barrier refers to any obstruction that is caused by the sender, message, or receiver during the process of communication. Talking to a friend in a coffee shop might be quite busy and very loud. You could have trouble hearing your friend clearly, which in turn might cause you to miss a critical word, phrase, or even an important part of his story. Examples of barriers include poor telephone or cell phone connection, poor audio quality or too much sound, inattentive receivers, poor image quality, misunderstanding of a message due to prejudice or inappropriate gestures. How does the process of communication work? Now that we are able to distinguish among the different elements of communication, it is time for us to know how the process moves fluidly between each of these elements. The communication process starts with the sender who wants to share an information with the receiver. This information is the message. In this case, the sender wants the receiver to know that he loves her, so the message here is I love you. Once the sender develops the message, he translates it into a form that can be transmitted to the receiver. This process is called encoding. What happens is that the message is encoded symbolically, such as in the form of words, pictures, gestures, before it is being conveyed. The sender selects the channel of communication that will be used. Should it be through a phone call, a letter, or should he just say it personally through a face-to-face conversation? The sender decides to use the cell phone. After the channel is chosen, the message then begins the process of transmission. Next, the message is received by the receiver, who undergoes the process of decoding. The message is interpreted, and the receiver attempts to analyze and understand it. Lastly, the receiver will provide a feedback in the form of a reply to the original sender of the message. In this case, the receiver sends an I love you too message to the sender. A mutual understanding is then formed between the two of them. The context refers to the circumstances of the situation in which this communication is taking place. In this case, interpersonal communication in the form of a dyad happened between the two. There are certain barriers that may be present during the communication process. These factors include lack of signal, poor audio quality, and noise. They can originate from the source or the receiver, from the channel used in sending the message, or outside the source and receiver's control. To sum it up, the sender develops an idea or message to be sent. He encodes the message and selects the channel of communication that will be used. The message travels over the channel of communication. Next, the message is received by the receiver, who provides the feedback if applicable. Both the context and the barriers surrounding this communication may impact the success of the communication process. Successful and effective communication starts with the right implementation of the communication process. Effective communication leads to understanding. It is through this process that the sharing of a common meaning between the sender and the receiver takes place. For effective communication to happen, we need to understand how the various elements work.